Tonight, we gather to explore ancient parables that have been quietly offering peace to restless minds for over 2,000 years. Not because they're complicated or require special knowledge, but because they speak to something true in every human heart. Something that recognizes itself when it hears wisdom. Before we journey together, you're welcome to share where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Our time together will unfold stories that might shift how you hold your worries, how you meet your days, how you find stillness even when the world feels overwhelming. These aren't just beautiful tales from long ago. They're mirrors that reflect back truths you already know, but may have forgotten. Truths about rest, about release, about the peace that's been waiting for you beneath all the noise. While you're here with these words, let yourself settle into whatever supports you. Your body knows how to rest. Give it permission. Take a gentle breath, slow and easy. And let's begin walking this path together. There's a particular exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from holding too tight. Not the tiredness of hard work or long days, but the bone-deep fatigue of gripping, controlling, trying to keep everything from falling apart through sheer force of will. The weariness of living with clenched fists, clenched jaw, clenched heart. Most people don't realize how tightly they're holding. The tension has become so familiar, it feels normal. You hold tight to your plans, needing them to work out exactly as you've imagined. You grip your relationships, terrified they'll change or end. You clutch at your sense of control, believing that if you just manage everything carefully enough, life will cooperate with your needs. But life has its own rhythm. Life flows like water, and you cannot grip water. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers. And still you keep trying, exhausting yourself in the attempt to hold what cannot be held. The Buddha taught something that sounds simple, but transforms everything when you truly understand it. He taught that attachment is the root of suffering. Not love, not care, not commitment, but attachment. The desperate clinging that says, "This must be mine. This must stay. This must not change." In a village nestled in a valley where morning mist settled like silk, there lived a woman named May, who tended the most beautiful garden anyone had ever seen. For 20 years, she had poured herself into this garden. Every plant was chosen with care. Every stone was placed with intention. Every morning she would wake before dawn to tend it, and every evening she would walk its paths as the sun set. People would travel from distant towns just to see May's garden. They would stand at the gate and marvel at the perfect arrangement of flowers, the way light fell through the carefully pruned trees, the harmony of colors that seemed to shift with the seasons, like a living painting. May's identity had become inseparable from this garden. When people spoke of her, they would say, "May, the one with the extraordinary garden." When she introduced herself, she would mention it within minutes. The garden was proof of her worth, evidence of her capability, the thing that made her special. But underneath the pride was terror. Terror that something would happen to the garden, that disease would strike her plants, that animals would damage what she'd built, that weather would destroy years of careful work. She couldn't travel because she feared leaving the garden unattended. She couldn't rest because the garden always needed something. She couldn't enjoy it because she was too busy protecting it. One summer, a terrible drought came. May watched in growing panic as the stream that fed her garden began to dry. She carried water from the village well, bucket after bucket, her back aching, her hands blistered. But it wasn't enough. The drought was too severe, too long. Day by day, she watched her garden begin to die. First, the delicate flowers wilted. Then, the shrubs began to brown. The trees that had taken years to shape stood with drooping leaves. She worked desperately, frantically, sleeping only a few hours each night, trying to save what she could. But the drought continued, and slowly, inevitably, the garden died. 20 years of work, of care, of love withering before her eyes. And with it, May felt herself withering too. If she wasn't the woman with the beautiful garden, who was she? If this thing she'd poured her life into could simply disappear, what did any of it mean? She stopped eating, stopped sleeping properly, stopped speaking to neighbors who came to offer comfort. She would sit in the dead garden for hours, surrounded by brown stalks and bare earth, trapped in her grief. A traveling monk passed through the village and heard about the woman who was dying alongside her garden. He found May sitting motionless among the ruins, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her without asking permission. For a long time he said nothing, just sat in the dead garden, present with the devastation. Finally he spoke. "I can see you loved this garden very much." "I gave it everything," May whispered. "And now it's gone. Everything is gone." "May I tell you what I see?" the monk asked gently. May didn't respond, but he continued anyway. "I see a woman who learned how to nurture life, how to be patient, how to observe carefully and respond to what she observed, how to create beauty, how to care deeply. None of those things died with the garden. Those capacities are still here, still alive in you. The garden was where you practiced them, but they were never the garden itself. They were always yours." May felt something crack open in her chest. She'd been so identified with the garden that she couldn't see herself separate from it. When the garden died, she thought she had died too. But the monk was right. Her ability to care, to create, to nurture, these hadn't died. They'd just lost their current form. "But what do I do now?" she asked, and for the first time in weeks, there was something other than despair in her voice. "If I'm not the woman with the garden, who am I?" The monk smiled softly. "Perhaps you're the woman who learned to let go. Perhaps you're the woman who discovers what else she can be. Perhaps you're someone you haven't met yet because you've been too busy being the gardener." He stood to leave, then paused. "The drought will end. Rain will come. Seeds remain in the earth. But maybe next time, you tend the garden without letting the garden define you. Maybe you love it without needing to possess it. Maybe you create beauty without making that beauty responsible for your worth." After he left, May sat for a long time in the silence. For the first time since the drought began, she felt her hands relax. She'd been holding so tight to the garden, as if her grip could keep it alive. But life doesn't work that way. Her attachment hadn't saved anything. It had only added suffering to loss. That night, rain came. Just a gentle shower, but it was the beginning. Over the following weeks, the rains returned, and slowly, life began to emerge from what had seemed dead. Seeds that had been buried sprouted. Roots that had survived underground sent up new growth. The garden was coming back, but different. Wild in places where it had been controlled. Surprising in its new arrangement. And May found herself different too. She tended this new garden with care, but not with desperation. She loved it, but didn't cling to it. She understood now that the garden was always temporary, always changing, and that was okay. Beauty didn't have to be permanent to be real. When visitors came to see the recovering garden, they noticed something new. The garden was lovely, yes, but what struck them most was the peace in May's face. She'd lost the tight, controlled expression she'd worn for years. Something had softened in her. This story shows something you might recognize in your own life. Think about what you're holding too tightly. Maybe it's a relationship you're terrified of losing, so you grip it so hard that you're actually pushing it away. Maybe it's a vision of how your life should be, and you're exhausting yourself trying to force reality to match that vision. Maybe it's control itself, the belief that if you just manage everything carefully enough, nothing bad will happen. That tight holding creates suffering even before loss occurs. You can't enjoy what you have because you're too busy trying to protect it. You can't be present because you're always anxious about the future. You can't rest because rest feels like letting your guard down. May discovered that her attachment to the garden was separate from her love for it. Love can be open, spacious, accepting of change. Attachment is tight, fearful, demanding permanence. The Buddha wasn't teaching people not to care about things. He was teaching them not to strangle the things they care about with desperate clinging. Right now, you might be able to sense where you're holding tight. Maybe there's tension in your body that goes beyond physical tiredness. Maybe there's an anxiety that hums beneath everything, the constant vigilance of trying to keep everything under control. That tension is exhausting, and it's optional. What would it feel like to relax your grip just slightly? Not to stop caring, but to hold what you care about with open hands instead of clenched fists? To love without demanding permanence? To care without needing to control? In a city known for its scholars and libraries, there was a teacher named Ches who had spent 30 years building his reputation. He was known as one of the wisest teachers in the region, and students would compete for a place in his classes. He'd written books that other scholars cited. He'd been invited to speak at prestigious institutions. His entire identity was wrapped around being a respected intellectual. Chen took great pride in his intelligence, in his quick wit, in his ability to understand complex ideas and explain them clearly. When people asked him difficult questions, he always had answers. When debates arose, he could argue his position with precision. Being smart, being right, being respected for his mind, this was everything to him. But as he moved into his 60s, something began to change. Small things at first. He would forget a word mid-sentence and have to pause awkwardly. He would lose track of an argument he was making. Names that he'd known for years would suddenly escape him. At first, he dismissed it as simple distraction. But it got worse. He began to confuse dates, mix up details, struggle to follow complex conversations the way he once had. The sharp, quick mind he'd relied on his entire life was dulling. Terror crept in. If he wasn't the brilliant teacher, who was he? His worth, his identity, his entire sense of self was tied to his intellect. Without that, he felt he would be nothing, nobody. He started avoiding situations where his declining memory might be noticed. He stopped attending debates. He declined speaking invitations. He began withdrawing from colleagues, afraid they would see what he was losing. One of his oldest students, now a teacher herself, noticed his absence from the monthly scholarly gatherings. She came to his home and found him surrounded by books, trying desperately to retain information that seemed to slip away faster than he could grasp it. "Teacher," she said gently, "what's happening?" The words tumbled out. His fear, his shame, his sense that he was losing the only thing that made him valuable. She listened quietly, then said something unexpected. "All these years I studied with you. Do you know what I remember most? Not the clever arguments or the brilliant lectures. I remember the day I came to you, devastated because my mother had died, and you said nothing. You just sat with me while I cried. You didn't try to explain death or offer philosophical comfort. You were just present. That's what I remember. Your presence, not your words." Chen stared at her. "But that's not teaching. That's just being there." "Maybe the best teaching has nothing to do with how smart you are," she said. "Maybe wisdom isn't the same as intelligence. Maybe you've been confusing the two." She visited regularly after that, and slowly she helped him see that the qualities his students had actually valued weren't his sharp intellect alone. It was his patience, his willingness to admit when he didn't know something, the way he listened carefully before responding, his genuine curiosity about others' ideas, his kindness when students struggled. None of those qualities required perfect memory. None of them depended on being the smartest person in the room. Chen began to let go of his identity as the brilliant scholar. It was painful, like grief. But in releasing that tight grip, he discovered something unexpected. Without the pressure to always be right, always be impressive, always have answers, he became more honest, more humble, more genuinely wise in a way that had nothing to do with how many facts he could recall. He started attending the scholarly gatherings again, but differently. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was from reflection rather than from a need to demonstrate his intelligence. And people noticed. His contributions had a different quality now, a depth that came from acceptance rather than striving. One evening, a young scholar challenged him on a point of interpretation. The old Chen would have defended his position vigorously, but now he simply said, "You may be right. I'm not certain anymore. Tell me more about how you see it." The young scholar was taken aback, and then, in that space of openness, a real conversation unfolded, not a debate to be won, but a genuine exploration of ideas. After the gathering, another teacher approached Chen. "You've changed. You seem more at peace?" Chen nodded slowly. "I spent my whole life being afraid of not being smart enough, and when I started losing my memory, I thought I was losing everything. But I was actually losing my attachment to being seen as intelligent. And underneath that attachment, there was something better, something quieter. I don't have a word for it yet, but it feels like wisdom without needing to prove anything." This story points to another form of tight holding, the grip you have on your image, on how you need to be seen, on the identity you've built, and now must constantly maintain. Chen had wrapped his entire sense of worth around being intelligent. When that was threatened, he felt himself disappearing. But identities are constructions. They're stories you tell about yourself, roles you play. And while they're not false exactly, they're not the whole truth either. When you grip them tightly, when you need them to stay fixed, you create suffering. Because everything changes, including the capacities and qualities you've built your identity around. Think about the identity you're holding. Maybe you're the capable one, the one who has it all together, and you can never let anyone see you struggle. Maybe you're the strong one, and you can't let yourself be vulnerable. Maybe you're the successful one, and any setback feels like a threat to your entire self. That tight grip on identity is exhausting. You have to constantly monitor yourself to make sure you're being consistent with who you think you're supposed to be. You have to hide the parts of yourself that don't fit the story. You have to keep proving over and over that the identity is real. What if you could hold your identity more lightly, not deny who you are, but not be imprisoned by it either? What if you could be intelligent without needing to always be the smartest? Strong without never being vulnerable? Capable without never asking for help? The peace Chen found wasn't in becoming someone else. It was in releasing his desperate grip on being someone particular. In that release, he became more fully himself, more authentically present, because he wasn't using all his energy to maintain an image. In a fishing village where the sea met rocky cliffs, there was a man named Dao who had learned his father's trade and his father's father's trade before that. 4 generations of his family had been fishermen, and Dao had always assumed he would be a fisherman until the day he died. It wasn't just what he did, it was who he was. He knew the waters like he knew his own hands. He could read the weather in the color of the sky. He understood the rhythms of the fish, where they would be in each season, what they would be feeding on. His skill had been built over decades, passed down through generations of accumulated wisdom. But when Dao was 50, an accident changed everything. A storm came up suddenly while he was far from shore. His boat was damaged, and in the chaos of trying to save it, his right hand was crushed against the rocks. The village healer did what she could, but when the bones finally set, Dao's hand was stiff, twisted. He could barely grip anything, certainly not well enough to handle nets and lines and all the delicate work fishing required. He tried to continue anyway. He modified his equipment, asked his son to help with tasks he could no longer do alone. But it was clear to everyone, including Dao, that he could no longer fish effectively. The thing he'd done his entire life, the thing that made him who he was, had been taken from him. Dao fell into a dark despair. If he couldn't fish, what was he? He would sit on the dock watching other boats go out, feeling like a ghost of himself. His wife would find him there at sunset, staring at the water, lost in a grief that had no words. Months passed this way. Dao's son took over the boat. Life continued around him, but Dao felt frozen, unable to imagine a future where he wasn't a fisherman. One day, a group of children gathered on the dock near where Dao sat. They were arguing about something, and gradually, Dao began to pay attention. They were trying to understand the tides, why the water came in and went out, why it was higher some days than others. Without thinking, Dao spoke. "It's the moon. The moon pulls the water." The children turned to him, curious. How does the moon pull water? And Dao found himself explaining, not with complex words, but with simple images they could understand. He drew in the sand, showing how the moon's position changed the water's height. The children listened, fascinated. One child asked, "How do you know when a storm is coming?" Dao looked at the sky, at the way the clouds were moving, the quality of the light. "You see how the clouds are? They're moving fast but low, and the wind has shifted. Feel it? That means weather is coming, probably by tomorrow afternoon." "Can you teach us?" one of the children asked. And something stirred in Dao. He'd been so focused on what he'd lost that he hadn't considered what he still had. He couldn't fish anymore, but the knowledge remained. The understanding of the sea, of the weather, of the patterns that govern this place, that hadn't been taken from him. He began to meet with the children regularly, not as a formal teacher, but just sharing what he knew. How to read the water, how to predict weather, how to understand the behavior of fish, even if you couldn't catch them anymore. The children absorbed it eagerly, and their parents noticed how much they were learning. The village elder approached Dao one evening. "What you're doing with the children, it's valuable. Our young people are losing the old knowledge. They don't learn to read the natural signs anymore. Would you be willing to teach more formally? Not just children, but anyone who wants to learn?" Dao felt something he hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Not the same purpose he'd had as a fisherman, but real nonetheless. He could still serve the village. He could still use what he knew, just in a different form. He began teaching regularly. Young fishermen would come to learn the old ways of reading weather and water. Children would come to learn about the sea. And Dao discovered that teaching brought its own satisfaction. Different from the satisfaction of a good catch, but genuine. One evening, his son sat with him after a teaching session. "Father, I need to tell you something. When you first couldn't fish anymore, I was afraid you'd never recover. I thought fishing was all you were. But I was wrong. Fishing was what you did, but who you are is someone who understands the sea. That hasn't changed. It's just expressing itself differently now." Dao felt tears in his eyes. His son was right. He'd been holding so tightly to the identity of fisherman that he couldn't see the larger truth. He wasn't just a fisherman. He was someone who loved the sea, understood it, could help others understand it. When he let go of the tight grip on the specific form that had taken, he could discover new forms. "I thought I'd lost everything," Dao said quietly. "But I'd only lost one way of being. There were other ways waiting. I just couldn't see them because I was holding too tight to the old way. This teaching about letting go isn't about giving up or not caring. Mei didn't stop loving gardens. Chen didn't stop valuing knowledge. Dao didn't stop caring about the sea. They let go of their desperate grip on a specific form, on a fixed identity, on the demand that things stay exactly as they were. And in that letting go, they found freedom. Freedom to adapt. Freedom to discover new possibilities. Freedom to be present with life as it actually was, rather than insisting it match their expectations. You might be gripping something right now. A plan that must work out. A relationship that must not change. An identity that must be maintained. A sense of control that must not be questioned. And that grip is creating tension, anxiety, exhaustion. What if you could relax that grip just a little? Not abandon what you care about, but hold it more gently. Not give up on your goals, but remain open to different paths. Not lose yourself, but free yourself from the prison of a fixed identity. The Buddha taught that clinging is suffering. Not having, not loving, not caring, but clinging. The tight fist that won't open. The desperate need for permanence in a world where nothing is permanent. The refusal to let life flow because you're trying to dam it up and control it. When you notice yourself holding tight, you can pause. You can feel the tension in that holding. And you can choose, just for this moment, to soften, to open your grip just slightly. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a small loosening. And in that loosening, you might feel something unexpected. Not loss, but relief. The relief of finally resting your tired hands. The relief of not having to control everything. The relief of trusting that you can meet what comes without white-knuckling your way through life. This is the gift of letting go. Not weakness, but wisdom. Not giving up, but opening up. Not loss, but liberation from the exhausting work of trying to hold water in your fists. There's a teaching in Buddhism about acceptance that gets misunderstood more than almost any other. People hear acceptance and think it means resignation, passivity, giving up, letting bad things happen without trying to change them. But that's not what acceptance means at all. True acceptance is the opposite of resignation. It's the most honest, most clear-eyed response possible. It's seeing reality exactly as it is, without the fog of denial or wishful thinking or resistance. And from that clear seeing, wise action becomes possible. When you're fighting with reality, insisting it should be different than it is, you can't respond effectively. You're too busy arguing with what is to actually deal with what is. But when you accept what is, you can work with it. You can respond to the actual situation instead of the situation you wish you had. In a monastery, high in mountains where snow fell 6 months of the year, there was a monk named Liang who came from a wealthy family in a warm southern city. He'd chosen monastic life seeking peace, seeking enlightenment, seeking an escape from the complexity and difficulty of ordinary life. But the reality of monastery life was nothing like he'd imagined. The days started before dawn with meditation in an unheated hall. The work was physical and demanding. The food was simple and repetitive. The winter cold was brutal, seeping into bones and staying there. And worst of all, his mind was just as restless, just as troubled as it had been in the city. Maybe more so, because now he had nothing to distract him from it. Liang found himself in a constant state of resistance. This shouldn't be so hard. It shouldn't be so cold. The meditation hall should be heated. The schedule should allow more sleep. His mind should be calmer by now. Everything was wrong, different from how it should be. He would sit in meditation fighting with discomfort. His back hurt, and he would tense against the pain, making it worse. His mind wandered, and he would berate himself for it, creating a second layer of suffering on top of the simple wandering. He was exhausted, and instead of resting when he could, he would lie awake, worrying about how tired he was. The head monk, an elderly woman named Ji, who had lived at the monastery for 40 years, watched Liang with patient concern. She'd seen many young monks arrive with romantic ideas about monastic life, and she'd seen how they responded when reality didn't match their expectations. Some adapted, others spent years fighting, making themselves miserable. One winter morning, when the cold was particularly bitter, she found Liang in the meditation hall after the morning session, still sitting, but with a look of absolute misery on his face. "How are you, Liang?" she asked. "I can't do this," he said through chattering teeth. "I've been here 6 months, and it's only getting harder. I thought by now I would have found peace, but I'm cold and tired and my mind won't settle, and I don't know if I'm even meant to be here." Ji sat down beside him. "Tell me something. How much of your suffering right now is from the cold, and how much is from fighting with the cold?" Liang looked confused. "What's the difference? The cold is real. I feel it too. These old bones feel every degree. But I'm not suffering about it. I'm just cold. You're cold and also angry that you're cold. Cold and also disappointed that monastic life includes being cold. Cold and also convinced you shouldn't have to be cold. That's 3 or 4 layers of suffering built on top of one simple condition. Being cold." She pulled her thin robe closer. "What if you just let yourself be cold? Not wish you weren't. Not resist it. Just be cold and be okay with being cold?" "How can I be okay with being cold?" Liang asked. "It's miserable." "Is it?" Ji asked. "Or is it just cold? Touch your hand. What does cold actually feel like when you're not arguing with it?" Liang touched his hand. It was cold, yes. The sensation was sharp, intense, but when he stopped thinking about how he shouldn't be this cold, how it wasn't fair, how he couldn't stand it, the sensation itself was just a sensation. Intense, but not actually unbearable. "Cold is just a sensation," Ji said gently. "Discomfort is just a sensation. They become suffering when you resist them, when you add all your thoughts about how things should be different. What you're learning here isn't how to escape discomfort. That's impossible. You're learning how to be present with discomfort without making it worse through resistance." Over the following weeks, Liang began to experiment with what Ji had said. When he was cold, he would notice the moment he started fighting with it. The thoughts would come. "This is terrible. I can't stand this. This shouldn't be happening." And he would recognize those thoughts as resistance, as his mind arguing with reality. And sometimes, not always, he could let those thoughts go and just be with the cold, just the raw sensation without the story. And it was remarkable how different that felt. The cold was still cold, but it wasn't torture anymore. It was just what was. He tried the same thing with other discomforts. The hard meditation cushion, the boring repetitiveness of certain tasks, the achiness in his back during long sitting periods. Each time he noticed himself resisting, arguing, insisting reality should be different, he would try to soften that resistance and just be with what was. It didn't always work. Sometimes the resistance was too strong. Sometimes he would catch himself an hour into fighting before he remembered he had a choice. But gradually, incrementally, he was learning the difference between pain and suffering, between difficulty and resistance to difficulty. One day, Ji asked him to help her chop vegetables for the evening meal. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of knives on cutting boards filling the kitchen. "Do you know why we have such a strict schedule here?" Ji asked. "Why we wake so early, why we sit so long, why we do hard physical work?" Liang had wondered this many times. "To discipline us?" "No, to give you countless opportunities to practice acceptance. Every time you wake up tired, you can practice accepting tiredness. Every time you sit and your back hurts, you can practice accepting discomfort. Every time the work is boring, you can practice accepting boredom. Life will give you all of these experiences anyway, here or anywhere else. We're just creating conditions where you meet them regularly, consciously, so you can learn to respond wisely instead of reactively. She set down her knife and looked at him directly. You came here thinking you'd escape difficulty. But the path isn't about escaping. It's about learning to meet difficulty without adding suffering on top of it. Once you learn that, the monastery or the city, comfort or discomfort, it doesn't matter as much. You've learned to be at peace regardless of conditions. Liang felt something click into place. All these months he'd been measuring his progress by whether he was comfortable, whether his mind was calm, whether things were easy. But that wasn't the point at all. The point was learning to be okay when things weren't comfortable, when his mind wasn't calm, when things were difficult. Years later, when Liang had become a teacher himself, he would often share this teaching with new monks. When you accept reality as it is, you're not giving up. You're seeing clearly. And from that clear seeing, you can respond wisely. But when you're busy fighting with what is, insisting it should be different, you're blind to what's actually possible. Acceptance isn't weakness. It's the foundation of wise action. This story reveals something crucial about how we create suffering. Liang was suffering not just from the cold and discomfort, but primarily from his resistance to the cold and discomfort. The resistance was worse than the actual difficulty. Think about your own life. How much of your suffering comes from the actual circumstances, and how much comes from your resistance to those circumstances? How often do you find yourself thinking, this shouldn't be happening? This isn't fair. I can't handle this. Those thoughts are resistance, and they create a second layer of suffering on top of whatever difficulty you're actually facing. A relationship ends, and you suffer from the loss. That's the first arrow, and it's real. But then you add, this shouldn't have happened. I should have been able to prevent this. I'll never find love again. Those thoughts create additional suffering beyond the actual loss. That's resistance adding more arrows. You make a mistake at work and you feel bad, but then you spiral into, I'm such a failure. Everyone must think I'm incompetent. I'll probably get fired. The mistake was one thing. The resistance to having made a mistake is creating most of the suffering. Your body gets sick and you feel unwell, but then you add layers of resistance. Why me? This is so unfair. I don't have time for this. My body is betraying me. The illness is challenging enough. The resistance makes it unbearable. Acceptance doesn't mean you like what's happening. It doesn't mean you don't work to change things. It means you start from a clear recognition of what actually is, rather than from an argument with reality. When Liang accepted that the monastery was cold, he didn't stop dressing warmly or stop feeding the fire when it was his turn. Acceptance didn't make him passive. It made him effective. He could do what was actually possible to work with the cold rather than wasting energy wishing the cold didn't exist. In a village known for its pottery, there was a young potter named Kaio who had very specific ideas about how things should be. She'd studied the masters, learned the traditional forms, and she approached each piece with a clear vision of how it should turn out. But clay has its own nature. Sometimes there would be an unexpected pocket of air that would cause a crack. Sometimes the glaze would flow in unexpected ways. Sometimes the firing would create effects she hadn't planned for. And every time something didn't match her vision, Kyo would feel frustrated, disappointed, sometimes angry. She would spend hours trying to force the clay to match her mental image. She would discard piece after piece that didn't meet her exacting standards. Her workspace was filled with rejected pots, each one testament to her resistance to how things actually were. An older potter named Sato worked in the same building. His work was beautiful, but in a different way. Less technically perfect, but with a quality of life and naturalness that people responded to. He rarely discarded pieces, and he rarely seemed frustrated. One day, Kyo was working on a bowl when a crack appeared during drying. She let out a cry of frustration and reached for the piece to throw it away. "Wait," Sato said gently. "May I see it?" Reluctantly, she handed him the cracked bowl. He turned it slowly in his hands, examining the crack. "This crack is interesting. See how it runs? It creates a kind of natural line through the design. What if you highlighted it with gold? There's a Japanese technique called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold. The breakage becomes part of the piece's beauty." "But it's flawed," Kyo said. "It's not what I planned." "It's different from what you planned," Sato said. "But that doesn't make it flawed. The clay has contributed its own idea to your idea. What if you worked with what is rather than fighting for what should be?" Kyo felt resistant to this. Her whole approach was about control, about making the clay obey her vision. But something in Sato's words nagged at her. She decided to try it. She finished the bowl, incorporating the crack into the design, highlighting it rather than hiding it. When it came out of the final firing, she had to admit it was beautiful. Different from what she'd planned, but beautiful in its own right. The crack she'd seen as a flaw had become a unique feature. The piece told a story now. It had character. She began to experiment with this approach. When something unexpected happened, instead of immediately seeing it as wrong, she would pause. She would look at what actually was rather than what should be. She would ask, "Can I work with this? Can I let the clay be part of the creative process rather than just the medium for my vision?" Her work began to change. It became less rigid, more organic. There was a flow to it that her earlier controlled work had lacked, and she found the process less stressful. She wasn't constantly fighting. She was collaborating with the clay, with the fire, with the unpredictable nature of the craft. Sato watched this transformation with quiet approval. One day he said to her, "You're learning acceptance. Not resignation, but true acceptance. You're seeing what is and working with it, rather than fighting for what should be. That's the heart of wisdom, in pottery and in life." This story points to something practical about acceptance. When Kyo stopped fighting with how the clay actually behaved and started working with it, she became more effective. Her work improved. She suffered less. She found more satisfaction in the process. Acceptance isn't about lowering your standards or not caring about outcomes. It's about starting from reality as it is. From that ground of reality, you can make wise choices about how to respond. If you're in a difficult situation and you spend all your energy insisting it shouldn't be difficult, you have no energy left to actually deal with the difficulty. But if you accept that, yes, this is difficult, this is what I'm facing right now, then you can ask, okay, given that this is the reality, what's the wise response? What's actually possible here? A relationship has problems. You can spend all your energy insisting the problems shouldn't exist, blaming your partner for creating them, wishing things were different. That resistance doesn't solve anything. Or you can accept that yes, there are problems. This is the current reality. And from that acceptance, you can have honest conversations, make real decisions, take effective action. Your body has limitations. You can fight against those limitations, resent them, pretend they don't exist. But that resistance doesn't change the limitations. It just adds suffering. Or you can accept your body as it actually is and work with it wisely. Rest when you need rest. Adjust your activities to what's actually possible. Find ways to care for the body you have rather than punishing the body you wish you had. You have certain feelings you wish you didn't have. Anxiety, sadness, anger, fear. You can resist those feelings, judge yourself for having them, try to force them away. But that resistance often makes them stronger. Or you can accept that yes, this is what I'm feeling right now. This is my current experience. And from that acceptance, you can be present with the feelings, understand them, let them move through naturally rather than getting stuck because you're fighting them. Acceptance is seeing clearly. It's the end of the exhausting argument with reality. It's the beginning of effective response. Right now, you might be fighting with something. Maybe it's your current circumstances. Maybe it's something about yourself. Maybe it's how someone else is behaving. Notice what it feels like to fight. Notice the tension, the frustration, the drain of energy. And then ask yourself, what if I accepted this? Just for now. Not forever. Not saying I like it or want it. Just acknowledging that this is what is. What would that feel like? You might find that acceptance brings relief, not because the situation has changed, but because you've stopped adding resistance on top of it. You've stopped creating the second layer of suffering. And from that place of acceptance, of clear seeing, wisdom about how to respond often arises naturally. Not from desperation or resistance, but from clarity, from being present with what actually is. This is the path. Not escape from difficulty, but the capacity to meet difficulty without making it worse. Not control over circumstances, but freedom within circumstances. Not fighting with life, but dancing with it, even when the music isn't what you expected. There's a quality that everyone seeks, but few understand. We call it happiness, but we look for it in all the wrong places. We think it comes from getting what we want, from circumstances aligning with our preferences, from achieving our goals and avoiding difficulties. But that kind of happiness is fragile. It depends entirely on conditions outside your control. It comes when things go well and disappears the moment they don't. You spend your life chasing it, occasionally catching it briefly, then watching it slip away again. Always temporary, always conditional, always just out of reach. The Buddha taught about a different kind of happiness. Not the fleeting pleasure that comes from favorable circumstances, but the deep contentment that comes from inner freedom. The peace that remains steady regardless of what's happening around you. This happiness doesn't depend on getting what you want. It comes from wanting what you have, from being at peace with reality as it is. This sounds impossible to most people. How can you be happy when things are difficult? How can you be content when life isn't giving you what you need? But the teaching isn't about pretending difficulty doesn't hurt or convincing yourself that bad is good. It's about finding the peace that exists beneath and beyond your circumstances. In a town at the crossroads of several trade routes, there lived a merchant named Feng who had built a successful business over 20 years. He'd worked hard, made smart decisions, and accumulated significant wealth. He had a large house, fine clothes, respect in the community. By any external measure, he should have been happy. But Feng was miserable. Not always, not obviously. But underneath everything was a constant anxiety. He worried about losing what he had. He worried about competitors. He worried about his investments. He lay awake at night, calculating risks, planning for contingencies, trying to protect his fortune. And whenever he got something he wanted, a new trade contract, a profitable season, the happiness lasted only briefly before the anxiety returned. Now he had more to protect, more to worry about, more to lose. He noticed that his porter, a man named Bo, who carried goods for minimal pay and lived in a tiny room near the market, seemed more genuinely content than Feng had ever been. Bo would whistle while he worked. He would greet each day with enthusiasm. He seemed to actually enjoy his simple meals, while Feng barely tasted his elaborate ones, too distracted by worries and business concerns. One day, Feng couldn't contain his curiosity. "Bo, how are you so happy? You have almost nothing. You work hard for little pay. You live in a room barely big enough to lie down in. How do you seem more content than I am with all my wealth?" Bo set down the box he was carrying and thought for a moment. "Master Feng, can I ask you something? When you eat your evening meal, what are you thinking about?" Business usually. The day's transactions, tomorrow's meetings, problems I need to solve. And when you lie in your comfortable bed at night, I think about my concerns, things that could go wrong, opportunities I might miss. Bo nodded. When I eat my simple rice and vegetables, I'm thinking about how good they taste, how grateful I am to have food. When I lie down in my small room, I'm thinking about how good it feels to rest, how fortunate I am to have shelter. We have different amounts of things, but I'm present with what I have and you're somewhere else, worried about what you might lose or might not get. Feng felt struck by this. Bo was right. Feng had everything he thought he needed to be happy, but he was never actually present to enjoy any of it. He was always somewhere else mentally, always anxious, always grasping for more or protecting what he had. But don't you want more? Feng asked. Don't you wish you had what I have? Sometimes, Bo said honestly, but mostly I enjoy what I do have. This body that can work, this mind that's healthy, these friends I have, the sunshine, the rain, the changing seasons. These things don't cost anything, but they're real, and I'm here for them. He picked up the box again. You have many things, Master Feng, but you're not really having them. You own them, but you don't enjoy them. I have few things, but I'm present with them. Which of us is richer? That conversation haunted Feng. He began to notice how rarely he was actually present, how he would be in one place, thinking about another, how he would be eating without tasting, lying in his comfortable bed, unable to sleep because of worries, walking through his beautiful garden without seeing it. He had confused having things with experiencing things. He'd thought accumulating more would make him happy. But each new thing just became one more thing to worry about protecting. He began to experiment with what Bo had described. During meals, he would try to actually taste the food, to notice the flavors, the textures, the fact that he was fortunate to have plenty to eat. When he walked in his garden, he would try to actually see the flowers, smell their fragrance, feel the sun on his face. It was harder than he expected. His mind wanted to wander back to worries and plans, but sometimes he could stay present. And in those moments, he felt something he'd been chasing his whole life without finding. A simple contentment. A peace that didn't depend on everything going perfectly. One evening, he sat in his garden truly present for perhaps the first time in years. The sunset was painting the sky in colors of gold and rose. Birds were settling in the trees. The air was cool and pleasant. He realized that this moment, right now, was completely fine. Nothing was wrong. He had food, shelter, health, safety. The sunset was beautiful. The birds were singing. There was nothing to fix or achieve or worry about in this exact moment. And the happiness he felt wasn't because his circumstances were perfect. It was because, for once, he wasn't somewhere else. He was here, actually experiencing what was happening rather than thinking about what might happen or should happen or could happen. This shift didn't solve all his problems. He still had a business to run, decisions to make, real concerns to address. But increasingly, he could separate what needed attention from what was just habitual worry. He could be present with his actual life rather than lost in thought about his life. And he found that he was actually better at making decisions when he wasn't consumed by anxiety. He could see situations more clearly. He could enjoy the process of work rather than just grinding through it to get somewhere else. Bo noticed the change in him. One day, as they were walking through the market together, Bo said quietly, "You seem different, Master Feng. Lighter somehow." "I'm learning something," Feng said. "Happiness isn't in circumstances. It's in presence. You taught me that, though I don't think you realized you were teaching." "Everyone is a teacher if we pay attention," Bo said with a smile. And everyone is a student. I learn from you too. What could you possibly learn from me? Feng asked, genuinely curious. That having much and being happy are different things. That wealth doesn't protect you from suffering. That we're all trying to figure out how to be at peace, whether we're rich or poor. That makes me feel less separate from others, less envious of what they have. We're all just human beings looking for contentment. This story points to something you might recognize. The way happiness seems to depend entirely on circumstances. Good things happen, you feel happy. Bad things happen, you feel unhappy. You're on a roller coaster going up and down based on external conditions completely outside your control. But notice what Feng discovered. The happiness he'd been seeking wasn't in having more. It was in being present with what he already had. His circumstances hadn't changed. He still had the same house, the same wealth, the same life. What changed was his presence with that life. And Bo's happiness didn't come from having little and being satisfied with that. It came from being present with his actual experience, truly tasting his food, truly resting when he rested, truly seeing the world around him. His contentment wasn't about his circumstances being perfect. It was about his relationship with his circumstances. This is radically different from how we usually think about happiness. We think we need to change our circumstances, get the right job, the right relationship, the right house, the right body, and then we'll be happy. But people who get all those things often aren't significantly happier than before. They just have a new set of circumstances to be anxious about, unsatisfied with, trying to improve. The Buddha taught that this kind of conditional happiness is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but perhaps better understood as unsatisfactoriness. It's the quality of never quite being enough, always chasing, never arriving, always thinking happiness is just one more achievement away. True happiness, the Buddha taught, comes from inner freedom, from not being at the mercy of circumstances, from finding peace regardless of whether things go your way or not. In a village near a sacred mountain, there was a woman named Hanna who had suffered a series of losses. Her husband had died young. Her business had failed. She'd lost her home and had to move in with relatives who didn't really want her there. By any measure, her circumstances were difficult. Everyone expected her to be bitter, to be depressed, to be angry at the unfairness of life. And sometimes she was. She wasn't pretending difficulty didn't hurt, but underneath the pain was something else, a stability, a peace that people couldn't quite understand given what she'd been through. A neighbor finally asked her directly, "Hanna, how are you okay? You've lost so much. How are you not consumed by grief and bitterness?" Hanna was quiet for a moment. "I do grieve. I do feel the losses. But I've realized something. My circumstances are difficult, yes. But my mind doesn't have to make them worse. I can meet difficulty without adding layers of story about how unfair it is, about how I'm cursed, about how my life is ruined." She gestured around. "I have food. I have shelter. I have my health. My nieces and nephews bring me joy. The mountain is still beautiful when I walk in the morning. The sun still rises. Birds still sing. My circumstances aren't what I would choose, but life still contains so much that's good. I can notice that, or I can focus only on what I've lost." "But don't you want things to be different?" the neighbor asked. "Of course," Hanna said. "But wanting things to be different and being miserable that they're not are two separate things. I can hope for better circumstances while also finding peace with current ones. I can work to improve my situation while also not poisoning my present with resentment about my present." She smiled slightly. "I spent some time after my husband died being angry at fate, being bitter, asking why me? And that bitterness didn't change anything except make me more miserable. The circumstances were the same, but I was adding suffering on top of them. When I stopped doing that, the circumstances were still hard, but I wasn't drowning in them anymore. This teaching about true happiness versus conditional happiness is one of the most practical ones Buddhism offers. It's not about positive thinking or pretending everything is fine. It's about recognizing where real peace comes from. Conditional happiness says, I'll be happy when I get what I want, when circumstances improve, when difficulties end. This puts your happiness always in the future, always dependent on things beyond your control. True happiness says, I can be at peace right now, in these circumstances, because my peace doesn't depend entirely on circumstances. It comes from how I meet this moment, from my presence, from my acceptance, from my freedom from the constant grasping for things to be different. This doesn't mean you don't work to improve your circumstances. Hana still hoped for better. Feng still ran his business. But they'd found a way to be okay even when circumstances weren't perfect. They'd stopped making their peace conditional on everything going right. Think about your own happiness. How much does it depend on circumstances being a certain way? How often do you think, I'll be happy when, or I'd be happy if? Each of those statements is making your peace conditional, giving away your freedom to external factors. What if happiness was available right now? Not because everything is perfect, but because you could be present with what actually is. Not denying difficulty, but also not denying all that's okay or even good in this moment. Right now, as you hear these words, notice what's actually present. Maybe you're comfortable. Maybe you're warm or cool enough. Maybe you're safe. Maybe you can breathe easily. Maybe there's nothing actively hurting right now. These things might seem small, unremarkable, but they're real. They're happening, and they're enough to support a quality of okayness if you're present with them. This is the happiness that doesn't depend on everything going your way. The happiness that remains accessible even in difficulty. Not because you're pretending difficulty isn't difficult, but because you found the peace that exists alongside difficulty rather than only in its absence. This is freedom. Not freedom from circumstances, but freedom within circumstances. The freedom to be at peace regardless. To find contentment, not by controlling life, but by being fully present with life as it actually is. There's a question that haunts many people, though they may not ask it out loud. They lie awake at night with it. They feel it as a background anxiety that colors everything. The question is, am I enough? Am I good enough, smart enough, attractive enough, successful enough, lovable enough? Just enough. This question creates enormous suffering. Because no matter what you achieve, no matter how much you improve, yourself, the question remains. You meet one standard, and the standard moves. You accomplish something, and soon you're worried about the next thing. The finish line keeps receding as you run toward it. Underneath this question is a belief. The belief that you need to earn your worthiness, that you have to prove you deserve to be here, to take up space, to be loved, to be at peace. That who you are right now, as you are, isn't quite enough. You need to be more, do more, achieve more before you're acceptable. This belief is so common, it seems normal. But it's the source of endless striving, endless dissatisfaction, endless exhaustion. You're trying to run a race that has no finish line. The Buddha taught something radical that directly confronts this belief. He taught that your fundamental nature is already whole, already complete, already worthy. Not because of what you've achieved or what qualities you possess, but simply because you are. Your being is enough. Your existence is enough. This isn't something you need to earn. It's what you are underneath all the stories about what you should be. In a monastery, known for its rigorous training, there was a monk named Hiro who had been practicing for many years. He meditated for hours each day. He studied extensively. He followed every rule with precision. But underneath all this practice was a desperate drive to finally be good enough. Hiro had grown up feeling that nothing he did was ever quite sufficient. His parents had been demanding, always pushing him to do better, achieve more. He'd carried that voice inside him, constantly critical, never satisfied. Becoming a monk had been partly an attempt to finally meet some standard, to finally prove his worth through spiritual achievement. But monastic life hadn't quieted that voice. If anything, it had gotten louder. He could always meditate longer, understand more deeply, be more disciplined. Every day felt like a test he was failing. He watched other monks who seemed at ease and wondered what was wrong with him. They must have something he lacked. They must be more advanced, more worthy, more capable. He was the defective one, the one who wasn't good enough. The head teacher, an old monk named Taka, had been observing Hiro for some time. He could see the striving, the self-judgment, the way Hiro was using practice as a weapon against himself, rather than as a path to freedom. One afternoon, Taka called Hiro to his room. "Tell me, Hiro, why did you become a monk?" "To find enlightenment," Hiro answered immediately. "To overcome my defilements, to become someone worthy of peace." Taka was quiet for a long moment. To become someone worthy of peace. That's an interesting phrase. It suggests you believe you're not currently worthy of peace, that you have to earn it through achievement. Hiro felt uncomfortable. Isn't that what practice is for? To purify ourselves, to become better. Practice is about seeing clearly, Taka said gently, about recognizing what's already true. But you're using it like a ladder, trying to climb to some place where you'll finally be good enough. And each rung you climb, you find the ladder extends further. You'll never arrive because you've set up a game you can't win. He poured tea for both of them. Let me ask you something. When did you become unworthy? Can you point to a moment when your fundamental value decreased? Hiro thought about this. He wanted to say it was when he failed at something, or when someone rejected him, or when he didn't meet his own standards. But he couldn't actually identify a moment when his basic worth as a human being had changed. You've been whole since the beginning, Taka said quietly. Worthy simply by virtue of being. You've had patterns of thinking and behaving that caused suffering. Yes, you've had ignorance and confusion. But underneath all that, your basic nature has never been defective. You've just believed it was. Hiro felt tears forming. This was too much to take in. His entire life had been organized around the assumption that he wasn't enough, that he needed to prove himself, improve himself, transform himself into someone acceptable. What you call defilements, Taka continued, are more like dust on a mirror. The mirror's nature is clear. The dust obscures that clarity, but it doesn't change the mirror's fundamental nature. Practice isn't about creating a clear mirror. It's about recognizing that the mirror was always clear and wiping away what obscures that clarity. He looked at Hiro directly. You don't need to become worthy. You need to recognize the worthiness that's been here all along. The worthiness you've been ignoring while you chase some fantasy of who you need to become. Over the weeks that followed, this teaching worked on Hiro in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He would sit in meditation, and that familiar voice would arise. You're not doing this right. You're not good enough. You need to try harder. And he would recognize that voice as the one he'd been believing his whole life. But now he had an alternative. What if that voice was just a voice, just a pattern of thinking he'd learned, not the truth about who he was? What if his worthiness didn't depend on getting meditation perfect or being better than he was? He began to notice how exhausting it was to constantly measure himself, judge himself, compare himself to others, how much energy he spent trying to prove his value. energy that could be used for actually being present, actually living, actually enjoying this life he'd been given. One morning during work period, he was sweeping the courtyard alongside another monk. Normally, he would be lost in thought, judging whether he was sweeping well enough, comparing his work to others, pushing himself to do better. But this morning, he found himself just sweeping, feeling the broom in his hands, noticing the sound of bristles on stone, seeing the morning light on the walls. He wasn't trying to be a good monk or enlightened being or anything special. He was just a person sweeping a courtyard, and there was something profoundly peaceful in that simplicity, in not needing to be more than he was in this moment. Taka passed by and noticed something different in Hiro's posture, a relaxation, an ease that hadn't been there before. "How's the sweeping?" he asked with a slight smile. "Just sweeping," Hiro said, and for the first time in years, he smiled genuinely. Taka nodded. "When you stop trying to prove your worth through sweeping, you can actually sweep. When you stop trying to prove your worth through meditation, you can actually meditate. When you stop trying to prove your worth through being alive, you can actually be alive. That's the freedom." Months later, a new young monk arrived at the monastery. This monk reminded Hiro of himself when he'd first come. Intense, driven, constantly striving, never satisfied. Hiro could see the suffering in it. One evening, he sat with the young monk after dinner. "Can I tell you something I wish someone had told me when I arrived?" The young monk nodded eagerly, probably expecting some profound instruction. "You're already okay," Hiro said simply. "Right now, as you are. You don't have to earn your right to be at peace. You don't have to achieve some state or become some ideal person before you're allowed to be gentle with yourself. This isn't a race you need to win. It's a path of discovering what was always true." The young monk looked skeptical. "But I have so many problems, so many flaws. How can I be okay like this?" "You have patterns that cause suffering," Hiro said. "Everyone does. And yes, those patterns can change, but having patterns doesn't make you defective. It makes you human. The practice isn't about hating yourself into transformation. It's about seeing clearly with compassion, understanding yourself rather than condemning yourself." He paused, remembering his own journey. "I spent years treating practice like punishment, like I had to suffer enough to finally deserve peace. But suffering doesn't purify you, it just makes you suffer. Compassion for yourself, acceptance of yourself, understanding yourself, that's what creates space for real transformation." The young monk was quiet, taking this in. "But won't I become lazy if I accept myself? Won't I stop growing if I think I'm already okay?" "That's the paradox," Hiro said with a smile. "When you stop fighting with yourself, when you stop treating yourself like a problem to solve, you actually have more energy for real growth. Not growth driven by self-hatred, but growth driven by curiosity and care. You change not because you hate who you are, but because you care about your own well-being and the well-being of others." This teaching about inherent worthiness confronts one of the deepest assumptions most people carry. The assumption that you have to earn your value, that you're born inadequate and have to spend your life trying to become adequate. But think about this carefully. When a baby is born, is it unworthy? Does it need to achieve something before it deserves to exist, to be cared for, to be loved? Of course not. Its existence itself is enough. It's valued simply for being. Somewhere along the way, you learned different. You learned that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned, that your worth depended on meeting standards, achieving goals, being a certain way. And you internalized that and made it your own voice, and now you carry it everywhere. But it was never true. It was just a story you learned, a belief you absorbed. and beliefs can be questioned, your fundamental nature, what Buddhists sometimes call Buddha nature, is already complete, already whole, not damaged, not broken, not needing to be fixed before it's acceptable. Yes, you have conditioning. You have patterns that cause suffering. You have ignorance and confusion. But these are like clouds passing across the sky. They don't change the sky's nature. The sky remains spacious and clear regardless of what weather moves through it. You are like that sky. Patterns of thought and behavior move through you, but they don't define your fundamental nature. Your essence is already whole, already worthy, already enough. This isn't spiritual bypass. It's not pretending you don't have areas to grow or patterns to work with. It's recognizing that growth doesn't require self-hatred as fuel. That transformation doesn't require you to condemn yourself as fundamentally defective. In a village by a wide river, there was a woman named Lynn who made her living as a weaver. She created beautiful textiles, but she could never enjoy her work because it never felt good enough. Each piece she finished, she would immediately see its flaws, the uneven threads, the slight imperfection in the pattern, the color that wasn't quite right. She would compare her work to other weavers' work and always find hers wanting. Theirs looked effortless, perfect. Hers looked like the work of someone still learning, still inadequate, still not quite there. This constant judgment extended beyond her weaving. Her home was never clean enough. Her appearance was never quite right. Her conversations never flowed as smoothly as she wished. She was never enough in any area of her life. One day, a renowned weaver from the capital came through the village. Lynn gathered her courage and brought some of her work to show this master, hoping for feedback that might finally help her become good enough. The master looked at Lynn's textiles carefully. She ran her fingers over the weaving, examined the patterns, held pieces up to the light. Lynn stood there, anxious, waiting for the judgment that would confirm what she already knew, that her work wasn't good enough. Finally, the master looked up. "These are beautiful, truly beautiful. Yes, have real skill." Lynn felt confused. "But they're flawed. See here, this thread is uneven. And here, the pattern isn't perfectly symmetrical." The master smiled. "Those aren't flaws. That's the signature of handmade work. That's how I know a human being with human hands created this, not a machine. The slight irregularities are what give it life, what make it unique." She held up one of the pieces. "If this were absolutely perfect, it would be sterile. Cold. The small imperfections are what make it warm, human, real. You're seeing problems where I see character." Lynn felt something shift, but the old voice immediately argued. "You're just being kind. Other weavers do better work than me. Other weavers do different work than you." The master corrected gently. "Each weaver brings their own style, their own vision. Comparison is pointless. You're not trying to be another weaver. You're trying to be the fullest expression of your own capability." She set the textile down. "But I sense this isn't really about weaving, is it? You judge yourself this way in everything, don't you?" Lynn felt tears forming. "I don't know how not to. I've always felt not quite good enough at everything." The master was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Let me tell you something I learned late in life. There is no good enough. It's a phantom standard that keeps moving. You meet it and it shifts. You achieve and it demands more. You're chasing something that doesn't exist." She touched Lynn's shoulder gently. "You're enough right now. Not because you've achieved some standard, but because enough isn't about achievement. You exist. You create. You try. You care. That's already enough. The rest is just the journey of expressing that enough in different ways." Lynn wanted to argue, but something in the master's words resonated with a truth she'd been avoiding. She'd spent her whole life trying to be enough, never realizing that enough wasn't something to achieve. It was something to recognize. Over the months that followed, Lynn began to practice a different relationship with herself. When the old voice arose saying she wasn't good enough, she would notice it. Just notice it as a voice, a pattern, a habit of mind, not the truth. She would look at her weaving, and instead of immediately seeing flaws, she would try to see what was actually there. The care she'd put into it, the creativity, the skill she'd developed, the uniqueness of her particular style. It was hard. The old pattern was deeply ingrained. But gradually, incrementally, she learned to see herself with less judgment, more compassion. Not thinking she was perfect, but not needing to be perfect, to be okay. She found that when she stopped constantly judging her work as inadequate, she enjoyed the process more. The weaving itself became satisfying rather than just a test she was constantly failing. And paradoxically, her work actually improved. Not because she was being harder on herself, but because she was more relaxed, more present, more in flow with the creative process. One day, a customer came to purchase a textile and mentioned how peaceful Lynn seemed compared to the last time they'd met. "You seem different, more at ease," Lynn smiled. "I stopped trying to be good enough and started accepting that I already am, not perfect, not without areas to grow, but fundamentally okay as I am. It's made everything lighter." This story reveals something about the exhaustion of constantly trying to prove your worth. Lynn was skilled, creative, capable. But she couldn't see it because she was measuring herself against an impossible standard. A standard that would never be satisfied because its purpose wasn't to be satisfied. Its purpose was to keep her striving, keep her feeling inadequate, keep her trying to earn what she already had. You might be doing the same thing. Always finding yourself wanting, always seeing what's wrong rather than what's right, always focusing on the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. But what if you're already enough? Not in some future when you've improved yourself, but right now. What if your worthiness isn't something to achieve, but something to recognize? This doesn't mean you stop growing or learning or developing. It means you do those things from a foundation of self-acceptance rather than self-rejection. You grow because you care about yourself, not because you hate yourself. There's a profound difference between those two motivations. Growth from self-hatred is driven by fear, shame, never feeling like you've done enough. Growth from self-acceptance is driven by curiosity, care, genuine desire to express your potential. One is exhausting. The other is energizing. One never ends because you never actually arrive at acceptable. The other is a natural unfolding because you're already acceptable and now you're just exploring what else is possible. Right now, you might be able to feel the weight of constantly judging yourself, the tiredness of never being quite good enough, the burden of always trying to prove your value. What if you could set that burden down? Not forever, necessarily. Not all at once. But just for this moment. What if just right now, you could accept that you're okay? That your existence is enough? That you don't have to earn your right to be at peace? This isn't arrogance. It's not thinking you're perfect or have nothing to learn. It's simply recognizing your basic worthiness as a human being. The worthiness you were born with. The worthiness that's been here all along, underneath all the stories about not being good enough. You are enough. Not because of what you've achieved, not because of your qualities or capabilities, but because you are. Your being is enough. Your existence is sufficient. This is the teaching. This is the truth the Buddha pointed to. Not that you need to become enlightened to be worthy, but that recognizing your fundamental worthiness is itself a kind of enlightenment. And from that recognition, everything changes. Not because you've become someone different, but because you've stopped fighting with who you are. You've stopped making your peace conditional on meeting impossible standards. You've come home to yourself. This is the rest that's been waiting for you. Not rest that comes after you finally achieved enough, but rest that's available right now when you recognize you already are enough. When you stop running towards some phantom finish line and simply arrive where you already are. Enough. Whole. Worthy. Here. Now. As you are. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from disconnection. Not physical pain, but the ache of feeling separate, isolated, fundamentally alone. This is perhaps the deepest suffering humans experience. The feeling that you're cut off from others. From life itself, from belonging. Most people spend their lives trying to overcome this feeling of separation in various ways. Through relationships, trying to merge with another person. Through achievements, trying to prove you matter. Through possessions, trying to fill the empty space inside. Through substances or distractions, trying to numb the ache of aloneness. But nothing quite works. Relationships are wonderful, but they don't eliminate the fundamental sense of being separate. Achievements feel good temporarily, but don't touch the deeper loneliness. Possessions accumulate, but the inner emptiness remains. And distractions only work while you're distracted. The Buddha taught something profound about this. He taught that the sense of separation is based on a misunderstanding, that fundamentally, you're not separate at all. You're intimately connected with everything, part of an interconnected web of existence where nothing exists in isolation. This isn't just philosophical. It's something you can recognize in direct experience when you look carefully. Every breath you take connects you with the air, with the trees that produced that oxygen, with the sun that powered those trees. Every bite of food connects you with soil, rain, farmers, countless beings. Your body is made of elements that were formed in stars billions of years ago. You're not a separate self enclosed in skin, cut off from everything else. You're a process that includes and depends on the entire universe. You're not in the universe. You're part of how the universe is happening right now in this particular location. In a coastal village where people made their living from the sea, there was a fisherman named Koji, who had always felt different from others. While his fellow fishermen seemed comfortable with each other, joking and talking easily, Koji felt like he was watching from outside, like there was a glass wall between him and everyone else. He would go to festivals and feel lonely in the crowd. He would sit with his family at meals and feel separate, even surrounded by people who loved him. He would lie beside his wife at night and feel utterly alone. It wasn't that people didn't like him. They did. He had friends, family, people who cared about him. But none of it touched the deep sense of isolation he carried. He felt fundamentally separate, and nothing seemed to bridge that gap. One day, far from shore, his boat developed a leak. He worked frantically to bail water and reach land, but the boat was sinking faster than he could manage. He was too far out for anyone to hear him call for help. Fear gripped him as the boat settled lower in the water. Then he saw another boat in the distance, also heading to shore. He waved frantically, and they saw him. They came alongside, helped him transfer his gear, took him aboard. He watched his boat slip beneath the waves, everything he'd worked for disappearing into the sea. The fisherman who had rescued him, a man named Takeshi, didn't say much, just helped Koji aboard, offered him water, steered toward shore. When they arrived, Takeshi helped him unload what had been saved and said simply, "The sea takes and the sea gives. Today it took your boat and gave you your life. Tomorrow, who knows? We help each other because we're all in these waters together." Koji felt something crack in his chest. The simple acceptance in those words, the assumption of connection, rather than separation. We help each other because we're all in these waters together. Not because it earned gratitude or created obligation, but because it was obvious. We're connected. What happens to you matters to me because we're not actually separate. Over the following weeks, as Koji worked to rebuild, He started noticing connections he'd never seen before. The wood for his new boat came from trees others had planted and tended. The knowledge he used came from his father and grandfather. The tools came from craftspeople he'd never met. The food he ate while building was grown and prepared by others. The encouragement and help came from neighbors and family. He'd always thought of himself as independent, a separate individual doing things on his own. But he'd never been alone. He'd been supported, connected, interdependent with countless people and forces every moment of his life. He'd just been blind to it. One evening, working on the boat, he had a strange moment of clarity. As he ran his hand along the wood, feeling its grain, he realized this tree had grown for decades, drinking rain, drawing nutrients from soil, reaching toward sun. And now it was part of his boat. The tree hadn't ended. It had transformed, become part of something else, just as this boat would eventually break down and become part of something else again. Nothing was really separate. Everything was flowing into everything else, including him. He wasn't Koji, the isolated individual. He was a moment in a vast process of interconnection. The food he'd eaten had become his body. His breath had come from plants. His thoughts had been shaped by everyone he'd ever known. The sense of being a separate self, cut off and alone, began to dissolve. Not all at once, not completely, but enough that he felt fundamentally different. He felt himself as part of something larger, connected, belonging. When his new boat was finished, he invited everyone who had helped to see it. As they stood around admiring the work, Takeshi smiled at him. "Good boat. You did well." "We did well," Koji corrected. "This boat exists because of all of us. Because of the tree and the sun and rain that grew it. Because of the craftspeople who made the tools. Because of everyone who taught me and helped me and encouraged me. I thought I was building it alone, but I never was. I've never done anything alone. I just didn't see all the ways I'm connected." Takeshi nodded. "That's wisdom. The fish knows it lives in water when you take it out. We know we live in connection when we feel separate. But the water's always there. The connection never actually breaks. We just forget it sometimes." This story points to something you might recognize. That sense of being fundamentally alone, of being cut off, of watching life through a window rather than participating in it fully. But look closely at your actual experience. Not your thoughts about your experience, but the reality of this moment. You're breathing air that came from somewhere else. You're hearing words that came from another mind. You're supported by something beneath you that you didn't create. You're surrounded by light that traveled from the sun. You're alive because of countless beings and processes you've never thought about. You're not separate. You never have been. Separation is an idea, a mental construct, not a reality. In actual experience, you're intimately interconnected with everything. When you breathe in, you're taking in the world. When you breathe out, you're giving yourself to the world. There's no moment when you're not in exchange, not in relationship, not connected. In a mountain village that relied on a spring for water, there was a woman named Yuki who lived alone by choice. She'd been hurt in relationships and decided people couldn't be trusted. She would keep to herself, do everything independently, pride herself on not needing anyone. She built her own shelter, grew her own food, managed her own life without asking for help. When neighbors tried to include her in village activities, she would politely decline. When someone offered assistance, she would refuse. She was proving she didn't need connection. She could survive alone. One harsh winter, she became ill. Nothing serious at first, but it weakened her. She couldn't tend her garden, couldn't gather firewood properly, couldn't do the 100 small tasks that living alone required. She lay in her cold home, trying to force herself to get up and work, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She was too proud to ask for help. She'd spent years proving she didn't need anyone. How could she admit she needed them now? So she stayed alone, growing weaker, telling herself she'd recover soon and manage on her own as she always had. But one morning, she woke to find her door had been repaired. Someone had fixed the hinge that had been broken. Outside, there was a stack of firewood she hadn't cut, a basket of food she hadn't grown or prepared. The neighbors had noticed her smoke had stopped coming from her chimney, had seen her garden untended, and without asking, without making her request help, they'd simply helped. Because that's what the village did. They took care of each other. Yuki felt overwhelmed with emotion. She'd spent years believing she was separate, that she had to be separate to stay safe. But even in her deliberate isolation, she'd been held by connection. The village hadn't let her fall, hadn't let her starve, hadn't let her freeze. Even when she pushed them away, they'd remained connected to her. As she recovered, she began to see her life differently. She thought she was independent, but she'd been depending on the spring the whole village shared, on the forest where she gathered wood that regenerated because others protected it, on the seeds she planted that had been developed and preserved by generations of farmers, on the knowledge she used that had been passed down through countless people. She'd never been separate. She'd just been pretending, and that pretense had been lonely, exhausting, unnecessary. She began to participate in village life tentatively at first, then more fully, not losing herself, but discovering that being connected didn't mean losing independence. It meant recognizing the truth, that we're all independent and interdependent, both at once. One day, a young person in the village told her they admired her independence, wanted to be self-sufficient like her. She smiled and said, "I thought being strong meant needing no one. But real strength is knowing you're connected and allowing that connection, being willing to give and receive, holding both independence and interdependence together. That's wisdom." This teaching about interconnection isn't asking you to lose your individuality or give up your autonomy. It's asking you to recognize that your individuality exists within and because of connection, not despite it. You are unique. Your perspective is yours alone. Your experience is your own, and you're completely interconnected with everything. Both things are true simultaneously. The loneliness you sometimes feel isn't because you're actually separate. It's because you believe you're separate. You've misunderstood the nature of reality. You've taken thoughts about separation as truth, when direct experience shows connection. Right now, notice connection. Notice how you're supported, how you're breathing, how you're part of this moment, which includes everything. You're not outside looking in. You're here, within it, part of it, connected to all of it. The glass wall between you and others isn't real. It's a construct of mind, and like all mental constructs, it dissolves when you look at it closely. When you actually pay attention to what's true rather than believing your thoughts about what's true. You belong here, not because you've earned belonging, but because you're part of the fabric of existence. You're woven into it. You can't actually be separate any more than a wave can be separate from the ocean. You are an expression of the whole, appearing as this particular form, this particular person, for this particular time, and recognizing that changes everything. The loneliness doesn't disappear entirely, but it's no longer the dominant truth of your experience. You feel held, connected, part of something larger, not in a vague metaphorical way, but as a lived reality. This is the gift of understanding interconnection, not just as an idea, but as something you recognize in your actual experience. The end of fundamental loneliness, not because you found the perfect relationship or achieved something special, but because you saw through the illusion of separation and recognized the connection that was always here. You're not alone. You never were. That voice that tells you you're separate, cut off, fundamentally isolated, it's lying, not from malice, but from misunderstanding. The truth is, you're held, connected, part of the vast web of existence, and always have been, and always will be. Because separation is impossible, it's not how reality works. This is what the Buddha saw under the Bodhi tree. Not just his own liberation, but the liberation available to everyone who sees through the illusion of separation, who recognizes their true nature as connection itself. And you can see it too. Right now, in this breath, in this moment, in the simple fact that you're here, alive, part of the miracle of existence unfolding. Not separate from it, part of it, inseparable from it. This is your home, this connection, this belonging, right here, right now. Not somewhere you have to get to, somewhere you've always been, just waiting to notice. As you've journeyed through these stories tonight, something has been happening beneath the level of words. Seeds have been planted. Not just information transferred, but something deeper touched. These teachings work on you whether you consciously try to apply them or not. You don't need to remember every story. You don't need to analyze every teaching. You don't need to make them into a project. They're working in you already, finding the places where they're needed, connecting with what you already know but may have forgotten. The exhausted grip that holds too tight. The resistance that creates more suffering than difficulty itself. The belief that you're broken and need fixing. The search for happiness in circumstances. The question of worthiness. The sense of separation. All of these patterns have been illuminated tonight, not to shame you for having them, but to help you see them clearly. And seeing clearly is where freedom begins. Not forcing change, but seeing what's actually happening. When you see the pattern clearly, choice becomes available. You're not trapped in automatic reaction. You can respond instead of just react. May learned to hold her garden with open hands instead of clenched fists. Chen discovered his worth beyond his identity. Dao found new expression when old forms ended. Liang stopped fighting with cold and found peace with what is. Feng discovered presence instead of constant anxiety. Hiro recognized worthiness beneath the striving. Koji saw through separation into connection. Each of them was you. Each of their struggles is your struggle. Each of their discoveries is available to you. Not because you have to work hard to become like them, but because what they discovered was always true. They just stopped overlooking it. This is the beauty of these teachings. They're not giving you something new. They're helping you recognize what's already here. The peace that's been waiting beneath your struggle. The freedom that's been present beneath your sense of imprisonment. The connection that's been here beneath your loneliness. The worthiness that's been true beneath your doubt. You don't have to become enlightened. You have to recognize what you already are underneath all the stories and patterns and conditioning. Like cleaning a dusty mirror. The mirror's clarity was always there. The dust just made it hard to see. So tonight, as these words come to a close, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to try to apply everything you've heard. You don't need to make yourself change or be better or finally get it right. You can simply rest. Rest in the recognition that you're okay right now. Rest in the release of trying to hold everything so tight. Rest in acceptance of what is. Rest in the presence that's available in this moment. Rest in your inherent worthiness. Rest in the connection that holds you always. Let your shoulders drop if they're holding tension. Let your breath move naturally, easily, without effort. Let your mind settle. If thoughts arise, let them arise. If there's stillness, let there be stillness. Whatever is here is allowed to be here. You have heard these teachings, and they'll continue to work in you. In your dreams tonight, in your waking tomorrow, in moments you don't expect, a recognition will come. A shift will happen. A pattern will loosen its grip. Not because you forced it, but because truth has a way of revealing itself once you've heard it. The monk who discovered practice in every moment, the potter who found peace with imperfection, the teacher who learned not knowing, the merchant who found presence over possession, the fisherman who saw his belonging. Each of them found freedom not by becoming someone else, but by releasing who they thought they had to be. That same freedom is yours. Not tomorrow, not after more practice. Now, in this moment, in this breath, in this simple fact of being alive, being aware, being here, you are enough. Your life is enough. This moment is enough. Not because it's perfect, but because enough isn't about perfection. It's about recognizing the sufficiency of what is exactly as it is. And from that recognition, peace flows naturally. Not peace that depends on everything going right, but peace that remains steady regardless. Peace that comes from knowing you're held, you're whole, you're home. These ancient parables have offered their wisdom. The Buddha's teaching has been shared in new forms for modern ears. But the heart of the teaching is timeless, eternal, always true. Let go. Be present. Accept what is. Recognize your worth. Feel your connection. Rest in this moment. This is the path. Not complicated. Not requiring years of study. Simple. Direct. Available right now. The path of coming home to yourself. Of recognizing what's been true all along. Of finally resting in the peace that's been here, waiting patiently for you to notice it. Sleep well tonight, held by these truths. Wake tomorrow still held by them. Live your life remembered that you belong here, that you're enough, that peace is possible, not someday, but right now. Thank you for walking this path tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And may you rest deeply, peacefully, held by the wisdom that's been shared, carried by the connection that never breaks, at home in the moment that's always now. Thank you for joining us here at Calm Buddha Path.